This is Duke University.
My name is Brittany Bridgen, and I was a student at Duke from 2012 to 2014. I got a master's in biomedical engineering, and currently I work as a director of internal communications at LifeSci Communications, which is an agency that works with small, mid-size, and large biotech companies and pharmaceutical companies to produce communications of a lot of different forms, including social media plans, PR, as well as medical communications and internal communications. Excited to be here. So I graduated from Duke with my master's in biomedical engineering. And over the course of my master's, was still trying to figure out what I wanted to do after school. The master's program is relatively short, 2 years, so you have to know pretty quick what you want to do after school. And I came into the program initially because I believed that engineering was a more lucrative career path than just as sort of a biological sciences career path. So was sort of automatically planning to do something with engineering. But along the way, I had the opportunity to work with Charlie Gershback on a little ed tech project where we tried to build an app that taught children about synthetic biology. And so it wound up being a communications project where I got to develop the storylines and the lessons plans and the pedagogy for this app to teach children about synthetic biology. And then I also got to do a lot of graphic design. I learned a little bit about coding. The coding was terrible. It didn't really work, but the rest of it was a lot of fun. So even though I was still planning and did in fact take a job as an engineer right out of school, it was a really fun exposure to communications and gave me a little bit of experience that I could point to later down the road. I didn't really plan for that, but it wound up being really good experience. When I left Duke, I took a job at a small medical device company, and as an engineer, and I was working in their lab helping to manufacture their medical device. And it was a small 10-person company, and it wasn't a very good culture fit. With such a small company, if you don't get along with one or two people, then you're not getting along with the majority of the company. And it wasn't the right group that worked for me. And so I, during my time there, again, kept thinking, I think that the theme is going to be, I'm going to continue thinking about what I want to do. So while I wasn't happy thinking about what parts of the job made me unhappy and what parts I liked, and then reflecting on my time at Duke and other experiences I'd had, and kind of came back to this project I did with Dr. Gershback on ed tech. And it was more the ed tech element. So that would have been 2014, 2015. Ed tech was very hot at this time. And so started looking around, trying to find anything that really would get me more into ed tech. And I took a job as a contract writer with a company called Sapling Learning. And Sapling Learning is a subsidiary of Macmillan Publishing, and they have a software, and Duke might use it, but they have a software that professors can build homework assignments and quizzes and tests. And so what I was doing with Sackling was I was writing the questions and the answers and the explanations for anatomy and physiology content for college courses. So college professor could go in and subscribe to this service, and then we'd have a pool of questions that they could use to build their quiz or their homework or whatever they wanted to test students' knowledge on. And they could build their lessons plans around it. So I was writing the content there. And it was a really good experience for me for a couple of reasons. Not only did it give me, it got me out, my initial reason for taking the job was to get out of that other job, to make that move. But it wound up being a really fantastic experience that greatly improved my writing. So they had some very specific guidelines for how things needed to be written. And so they gave great feedback. So not only were there specific requirements to write to, they also told you how to improve your writing. And so there was a lot of coaching involved, and they eventually had you edit other authors' work. So it was really a deep dive into writing. And then since it was a contract job, I worked from home. So way back in 2015, I was already working from home. And it allowed me the flexibility to move. So when life brought me up to Boston, where it's much more expensive to live than Durham, I decided I need to take on another contract since the cost of living is much higher. And through my Duke network, I got a contract writing for CRISPR Therapeutics. And it exposed me to a very different type of writing. So with CRISPR Therapeutics, I was writing very scientific, very technical reports for their FDA filings and their legal filings. So I had the skills to read and write very technical information and translate it into some very digestible sound bites from writing with Sackling, but it was very different reasons. But the skills were directly translatable and gave me exposure to this small biotech world. After CRISPR, I took another contract writing for another small biotech called SQZ, or Squeeze Biotech. And they eventually brought me on full time to initially help with their grants. So they were writing, they needed help writing grants for the NIH and the NSF. And so they brought me on to write their grants. And because I was full-time, my job eventually evolved to take on many other forms of communications within the scientific and biotech industry, which includes, again, social media, websites, internal, employee communications are big. I found that that's what I like doing the most. But it also includes media outreach and investor relations, and it exposed me to a whole host of communications and writing that I didn't know about before joining Squeeze. And those experiences then brought me to my current job at a PR agency. Scientific communications can take many different forms. Those that I'm familiar with are mostly from the company side of things. So I've worked not only for a small biotech company, but I now work at an agency that works with many different small biotech companies. And in a nutshell, it is about, communicating your science. And it gets more complicated when you think about the reasons why somebody's communicating science and who they're communicating the science to. So for a biotech company, for example, the company will need to share their story and share their science and their data and why it matters to, for example, investors to raise money, or to doctors to get the doctors interested in the therapy that they're trying to produce. They also need to communicate it to people they want to hire, so scientists, as well as their own scientists. Employee communications has become my sweet spot over my career, and keeping your own people informed and engaged can be very difficult. So I guess so. Science communication in a nutshell is just communicating the science, but it can be. So my experience with science communication is from the biotech side of things, but it can also be within the medical community. Doctors need to have a certain level of education, and they need to stay relevant, or they need to stay up to speed with the most current research and findings and information. And there's science, there's medical education. I'm not as familiar with it, but there's science communication there. I think the most challenging part about my work and science communication in general is often taking a very complex piece of data or biological process and translating that into something that is engaging. So it's got to be short and accurate and can be understood by somebody who doesn't have a scientific background. So that's on average the hardest part, and it's the most rewarding part when you have succinctly narrowed down a great big process into a really nice, digestible piece of information. Is really fun to see come together. Some of my favorite projects have been around employee comms, as I've mentioned, being sort of my sweet spot. Employee comms, again, the key to really good employee comms is keeping things engaging and consistent. And so while I was at Squeeze Biotech, the company grew very quickly, and it became very difficult for people to stay in touch with one another and understand what different teams were working on and why. And understanding why certain groups across the company, or why you're even working on your own project, is important, because it can make you feel connected and motivated to the project if you understand what the purpose is. And so we worked on building a newsletter to share updates from across the company. And what it meant for me was that I got to work with different teams. I think at the time there were 5 or 6 different scientific teams working on different projects, from diabetes to cancer to new sort of genetic exploration type projects. And I got to sit down with them and say, what was really cool that you worked on this month? Why did you why do you think it's really cool? Why is it important? Do you have a cool piece of data you can share with me? And then I worked with them to distill that down into something really small that our accountants and HR and non-scientific people at the company could understand. And part of that was making it look nice and developing some graphics to go with it, and taking, again, a really complex process and boiling it down to a paragraph and putting together this nice, attractive, engaging newsletter that folks enjoyed, and I got a lot of really good feedback on it. COVID really highlighted for everyone the importance of good communication. That without good communication, things get very, very difficult when you can't physically be in the same room as somebody. And so there have been a lot of really interesting trends come out since lockdown and since the height of COVID, about how to better engage, not only with those external audiences, so investors or doctors or patients, but with your own people, so that across Zoom you are still getting the results you need, and that people are getting their job done without having to be in the same office space as one another. And so there's a lot of ongoing chatter about how do we continue to leverage what we learned from COVID, what you can and cannot do effectively over Zoom. And you can get a lot done over Zoom, especially for somebody in my field. But then how do you marry that with us not needing to be in, remote anymore? And so the trends of quiet quitting comes up on my LinkedIn feed, or employee engagement, and there's a lot of how do you make people feel connected, and what tools do you use in the virtual world, as well as in face-to-face interactions to help people do their best work. And so I find that all very, very interesting. I think for skills that are useful within science communications, or any type of communications, is, especially early in your career, is writing, getting lots of experience writing. And it doesn't have to be necessarily for a job specifically. The writing I did, and the experience I got doing the project during my master's with Charlie Gershback was something I pointed to for a while as valuable experience. So even if it's writing in a personal blog that you would feel comfortable sharing in a professional type situation, to demonstrate that you write cohesively and coherently, and that you can frame up a problem and a solution or an argument, is very, very valuable to have. And the more examples you have to point to, the better. And the more you can get feedback on your writing, the better. So even if it's a blog, if you have someone that will go in and edit it and provide feedback, lean into that, because most things, even now, if I write them, they're not written in a vacuum. I'm not the only one who has my hands on it. There are usually multiple people on any one thing, even little things like emails. I will get feedback and solicit feedback on to make sure that it's hitting the right notes and it's conveying the right message. So getting experience in writing as much as possible, and then having people give constructive feedback as much as possible as well. I think that the Reagan Institute has a lot of really good free webinars and articles on writing. So it's an institution for communications professionals. So they work with folks like me on the PR side, as well as journalists and HR professionals. And so they provide tips on, getting the best, they provide, writing tips that even now I use. They provide webinars on different strategies for getting the best story out of when you're doing journalistic type reporting. And so for anything communications related, Reagan is really good. Reading and exploring different scientific publications. And not only just reading that, if there's an article that you need to read for a class, not only reading the article, but exploring a little bit the how and why the article is printed a certain way. I've learned over the course of my career, with Nature, they have different issues, and they put a lot of special care into how they organize the articles and which articles get featured in which sections, and they're extremely rigorous with how who gets into Nature. So understanding and looking into the different references included in the article, and reading more and digging in a little bit more into the article beyond the main text section. Is I think would be really, really helpful for anyone in scientific communications, because whether you're actually writing the scientific article or using it as a citation, that just being extremely familiar with every element of an article beyond the text will be very handy throughout your career. You will continually throughout your career, I think you should be asking, what do I want to do next? And is this working for me now? There's a career is a path, and it really is about the journey. So as you're whatever job you're in, you'll get experience and you'll get skills. And if it's something you like, then identifying what you like is very valuable. But if it's something you don't like, identifying what you don't like about the job is equally valuable. Because both knowing what you like and what you don't like will help guide what you do next. So having those self-check-ins every year, every month, however often you want to do it, will continue to help you regardless of your career stage.